Welcome everybody, welcome to the Goodlife Coffee Company. My name is David, I'm the director of the company, and today we're going to talk about coffee. So what is coffee? Very important to understand what is coffee. Coffee is a fruit. The coffee bean comes from a tree, the coffee tree. So the coffee tree is a very small tree, 2 meters, 2.5 meters, and on this tree you have some cherries that are growing in grapes. So on these grapes you have a lot of cherries on it, and these cherries are growing and are ripening, are growing to maturity. The maturity is different for every cherries. This is why in the coffee world most of the time the coffee is harvested by hand. Like this, the harvester can look at the grape and select which cherry is mature and which is not. The mature cherry will be handpicked and then put in a bag. Let's take a little step backward and understand the difference between terroir. So what is a terroir? The terroir is an expression of a region. It's an expression of where a plant lives, about the soil, about the difference in soil, about the difference in the rain that the plants receive, about the difference in the sun that the plants receive. The coffee grows in different parts of the world, and so by this there is different expressions for the fruit. Different expressions coming from different terroirs. What I mean by this is that not every coffee bean has the same taste. This is why it is important to understand this, the variety that exists in the world of coffee. Coming back to the tree. So we have our tree, we have our cherries. The cherries have been picked carefully by the farmers, by the picker. Then what do we do to come from a cherry, from a fruit to the bean? What does happen? So if you look closely, the green bean that we see here has a flat face. And so this is why this is a cherry where around you will have pulp. The pulp of the cherry has to be removed. It is removed by, most of the time, what we call a wet mill. This wet mill removes the pulp, and then we clean the bean. We clean this bean, and then once it's clean, it will be a little bit wet, so we have to dry it. So the farmers will lay them. There is different techniques. If you are, let's say, in Brazil or in Kenya, there is different method to dry the coffee. But the coffee beans are placed and dry, mostly sun-dry. Then, when the coffee has been transformed, so the method that I just explained before, what is called the wet process. So this wet process is represent the washed coffee. So washed coffee is this. Washed coffee. So we take the cherry, we remove the pulp, and then we wash it with water and we dry it. It results in a green bean that is relatively homogeneous and relatively clean. If you look at the surface of the bean is pretty sleek and pretty vivid in terms of color. So this is the washed coffee coming from Guatemala. This coffee. Then here we have what we call natural coffee. So what's the difference? Important to understand. Natural coffee is then we come back to our cherry, to our fruit, but we don't remove the pulp straightforward. What happens with natural coffee is that we leave the pulp and the coffee bean inside together after harvesting, and we let them rot. The sugar that is inside the skin of the coffee, this sugar will then act on the green bean and create what we see there is what we call a mucilage. So the mucilage is also known as fox skin, is this little orange, create a little orange color. So this is the fruit coming onto the green bean, and then we depulp it, and then we remove the pulp, and then we dry it. So we follow the same process. So remember that the difference between both is that for this one, we remove the pulp straightforward and dry it. And for this one, we keep the pulp and we leave it and then we remove it. But there is from 6 to 7 days, then it depends on the farmer, 6 to 7 days where the pulp of the cherry is kept on the green bean. So what's the difference? Because you will tell me, why do we do this? Why don't we wash all the coffees? Washed coffee is more simple. Washed coffee will give you a more homogeneous coffee that has, let's say, tastes that are very used in the espresso world, such as full body, almond, chocolate, nuts. All these tastes comes from the washed coffee. For natural coffee, therefore, as we had a little fermentation, remember, we had the skin of the cherry that was left on the green bean. So what does it create? What is the difference? This little fermentation, it's a transformation of sugar that contaminates, kind of, the green bean. This contamination will bring you fruitiness, will bring you another expression, will bring you more complexity. So a lot about fruits and floral. If you could smell what I'm smelling now, this coffee smells a bit like tropical fruits. Always important to remember, coffee comes from a tree, from a terroir, from a bean, from a cherry that is harvested by hand carefully, that is cleaned to have these two beans for you in your hands. And then we roast the coffee and we have this beautiful product. So always keep in mind when you drink a cup of coffee, all the cherries that have been picked and all the efforts that have been made in creating what is the coffee. And now, a little tips, always important. So how can you recognize when the coffee is roasted? How can you recognize natural coffee from washed coffee? We take both coffees there. Main difference. So this is a washed coffee, washed roasted coffee, natural roasted coffee. The main difference that we see is that the washed coffee has the center is a little blonde line. This is how you can recognize washed coffee. And in opposition, natural coffee has always a center that is brown. Very useful, like this, if someday you have to buy coffee, you need to select a coffee, you want something that is more fruity, more floral, you look for natural coffee, but there is no label, nothing, the coffee is in bulk, you can still recognize what's a washed coffee and what's a natural coffee. And another step important to understand is that coffee travels in jute bags. So as you can see, these bags are pretty big, pretty heavy, because the green bean of coffee is dense and full of water, pretty heavy. These bags, average, they do between 60 and 70 kilos. What is important to realize as well is, as you can see, the bag is completely full of these green beans. And if you remember, 2 beans makes a cherry. I didn't count how much green beans there is in one bag, but I can assure you that there is a certain number which represents a lot of work on the side of the farmer. So important to realize and be conscious how many cherries need to be picked to make a single bag of coffee. Okay, so now that we saw our green beans and now that we know the difference between a natural and a washed coffee, remember, this coffee is coming from a farm. Here we talk about a coffee from Uganda, from the region of Mount Rwenzori, harvested by George William. So this coffee, if we think a little bit, if we continue to look closer at the bean, all these beans are coming from trees that have grown in the same region, in the same part of the world, in Uganda. And so imagine if we look closely, if we could look at the genetics of these beans, they would be kind of all like brothers and sisters, all similar. They share the same profile, they have grown in the same area. So now what we're going to do is that we're going to take all these beans that are very similar and are very closely the same, and we're going to roast them. To do so, we need a roasting machine. So the roaster that we see here, it functions with 2 main functions. The roaster, I like sometimes to say that it's a mix between a washing machine and an oven. Imagine here you have an axis, there is a drum there, And in the drum, there is some blades that are rotating to blend the coffee. So that's the washing machine, and underneath you have a rack of flames that is an oven, flames that you can modulate to adjust the temperature of the roasting. Every bean from every origin, that it can be Colombia, Brazil, Uganda, Kenya, we never roast the beans the same from various reasons. The main reasons being, for example, the density of the bean. You don't cook things that are smaller and that are bigger at the same intensity. So the roasting machine is here. You load the beans through here, through the hopper. Once the beans are loaded, you warm up the machine. You warm it up before. You preheat it. The machine is warm around 200 degrees Celsius. And once you're ready, you just push and the beans falls inside. The machine starts rotating and dry the beans. And once the roasting is finished, you just open the gate and the brown beans flows. So now we are finally ready to roast. The machine is heated up at 200 degrees, 210 to be precise, and Antonin, our head roaster, will load the machine through the upper part of the roasting machine. So loading the green beans, all from the same origin. Now we're roasting some natural coffee from Brazil, all coming from the same region of Alta Mogiana. We're now heating up a little bit more, putting up a little bit more power, more gas, to be sure that when the bean comes in, we are at the right temperature. So now the beans are in the drum. Remember, our green beans are very dense and full of water. So these beans, and also they are cold now. The machine is at 200 degrees. What is going to happen? You have two variables. One variable is the temperature and the other variable is the time. This is how we define what we call a roast profile, okay? So the temperature was set at 220 degrees. We dropped the beans. The temperature is going to drop now. So it's dropping, and it is going to reach 65 to 70 degrees Celsius. And then it will start. So then the machine will be at this temperature, and then it will start to heat again. During that phase, that first phase, when the temperature goes back up, this phase is called the drying phase. So it is between 70 degrees and 150 degrees Celsius. So the drying phase is a step when the beans are gently being dried, very simply. So the bean is going to start to lose water. This phase is going to last for a few minutes, the drying phase, up to 150 degrees. If I look at the temperature, yes, now we are at 85 degrees Celsius, so we are inside this drying phase. Okay, so now we left the drying phase and we are entering what we call the Maillard phase. The Maillard phase happens at 150 degrees, and this is when the coffee bean starts to come yellow and slightly brownish. What we can smell, now the bean starts to smell a bit like brioche, a bit like baked dough, and this is when it starts to develop the body of its aromas. Okay, so now that we left the drying phase, the Maillard phase, we can also call the yellow point, the change in color. Now the machine has reached 200 degrees, the coffee beans as well, and we are entering what we call the first crack. So the first crack, and you can hear it, the first crack is when the bean is warm enough and starts to open itself like popcorn. It opens and it cracks. It's the last piece, let's say, the last
water that was contained in the bean that goes out. So it cracks and it opens up. And right after the first crack, it's called the development phase. So the development phase, the bean is entirely dry, it's at 200 degrees, and the aromatics inside the bean that we call the phenol, so it's oil, aromatic oils that are within the bean, that are starting to agitate themselves pretty quick and to generate the fineness of the aromas. And this is a development phase. It's a phase that is pretty short in time, that can last, for this coffee, it will last 2 minutes and a half, and it's very critical. If you leave it too long, the coffee will become too dark and too bitter. If it's too light, too short, you will have a coffee that is a light roast, more done for filter coffee, for example. Whereas now we are lingering towards an espresso roast, espresso profile with that development. Okay, so now the coffee is ready. We're almost close to the 2-minute 30 that we were talking before of development. We are opening, so we are going to free up the coffee. The brown coffee is going to go out, and it's very important to cool it down because it goes out at 210 degrees, so it's super hot, and we want the cooking to be stopped. So to do that, there is a fan behind that absorbs cold air, and then that mixes the brown coffee to cool it down very fast. So it's important, it's like the same as when you cook something in an oven, you need to stop the cook like this, it remains where you want it to be. Now that our roasted coffee is roasted and is cooled down, there is going to be one very last step. It's called the destoning. So why do we destone? Remember the jute bags? Remember the farm? Remember the green coffee? When the green coffee is put in jute bags, the farmer does their best to use filters to remove any foreign objects, any very small stones. Therefore, the green bean itself can have the same size and the same weight and density as a small rock, a small stone. So the coffee the green beans comes with stones inside sometimes. What happens now is that the coffee has been roasted and it lost its weight, it lost its water. So with this machine called the destoner, we are going to put the brown coffee inside with potential stones inside, put it in the bin here. The engine is going to suck up the brown coffee and the stones that have been, of course, unroasted and that have kept the same weight are going to be found in a very small basket beneath. So now it's being absorbed, and then we're going to take the clean brown coffee through the other extent and put it in a bin for degazing. And we will talk about degazing in a few seconds. Okay, so now all the brown beans are inside this tank and are ready. So I'm just going to pivot the machine and collect the coffee that has been destoned. And let's have a look. And yes, in fact, one very little stone, and it looks like a coffee bean, but it's rock. It's a very small rock. Okay, so now that our coffee has been roasted, it has been also destoned, it is very important to let it degaze. So the coffee, when it comes out from the cooling tray and the destoner, Remember, it is at 200 degrees and the aromatics phenols are inside and still very vibrant inside the bean. So in order for this phenol to express their aromatics, they need to cool down and calm down. This process of degazing takes 48, 72 hours, so 2 or 3 days. So during this process, the coffee will degaze. And so this is why it is very important that we store the coffee in boxes that are not hermetic, okay? Like this, it can degaze properly. And so our roasted coffee is there. And this is why as well, in specialty coffee, when you buy fresh coffee, most of the time, you see that on the bags, there is a degazing valve. These valves enables the coffee to breathe out. It's a one-way valve. Like this, the bag doesn't explode. And here we are, and we have our coffee ready to drink. So, the course is over. I hope you have enjoyed it and that you have learned how the coffee is made, how to go from the bean to the cup. Very important to understand the different steps that we have. I really hope that you enjoyed the video. It was a pleasure for me. Thank you very much for your attention. And don't forget, always think when you drink your coffee, think where it's made.